Alright, so we're going to go ahead and get started with one of our biggest body systems that we're going to get into in this class, and that is the skeletal system. Before we get into the individual parts of the skeletal system, though, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the general things going on with it, including the bone tissue. Some of this will be a little bit of a review from when we went over all of the different tissues, but some will definitely be new. If you have forgotten anything from before, I would definitely take a look back at the tissues chapter just to refresh yourself. Alright, so what are we going to talk about with this particular chapter? We're going to talk about the bones, we're going to talk about their functions, the different classes of bones, how bones form and how they're developed, and then also how do bones repair themselves after an injury. And then we'll also get into things that impact the bones like exercise, nutrition, and hormones. So what are the functions of the skeletal system? We're going to hopefully get into this in some detail. But we're going to talk about what bone even is, what is cartilage, and the skeletal system in general, and then talk about the functions. So the skeletal system is made of two main components, bone, which that kind of goes without saying, but also cartilage. So when we say bone, we're talking about osseous tissue, and so you'll see osseous or os or osteo as a prefix for a lot of terms involving bone. And this bone is going to be a supportive connective tissue that is solid. It has a solid matrix. Cartilage, which is also a supportive connective tissue, will be involved. However, the difference being that the matrix in cartilage is semi-rigid or a semi-solid. It's almost like a gel to some degree. So they're similar, but they do have some major differences, especially in terms of what they're capable of doing functionally. What are the major functions of the skeletal system as a whole? One is probably the one that first jumps out at you, is that we are providing support to the body when we look at the skeletal system, right? It functions as a framework for us to build other body parts onto. So you think about like your muscles and your muscular system that do contraction to allow movement, but those muscles need some sort of framework to anchor on. It's kind of like if you build a house. Right? If you build a house, you need to have a framework to put your walls up, to put in your plumbing, to put in your electrical, right? So you think of the skeletal system like that wooden framework that your house could have. Just like I mentioned before with the muscles, the bones will also facilitate movement, right? Because they provide that anchoring system for the muscles. Without the bones, there is no movement. Third one is protection of internal organs. This is especially true when we look at the trunk and the head. So you think about the skull protecting the brain and the rib cage protecting the heart and the lungs. Right? We're getting some protection for very sensitive, very vital body parts. And some of the ones that you may not remember or be as familiar with, the skeletal system is also responsible for producing blood cells. We'll talk about blood cell production in a later chapter, but keep that in your head for now. And it also is going to store and release minerals and fats, such as calcium. Right? So we'll kind of talk about that when we get to the hormone section of this chapter as well. So here's just our example of bones protecting the brain in this case, right? Super soft, squishy brain that needs protection. Hard bones going all the way around are going to provide that protection. There's some other components that also provide protection for the sensitive brain. However, they're not part of the skeletal system, and we'll get to those parts later. So let's go ahead then and talk about bone structure. So we're going to get through this. We're going to talk about the anatomical features of bone and talk about different bone markings. We're also going to get into the histology of bone tissue a little bit more than we did in the tissues chapter. We're going to look at both compact and spongy bone, talk about their structures, compare them, contrast them, and then we're going to talk about how bones are nourished and innervated. So we're going to start with the generic long bone first and talk about some of the structures, some of the parts of the long bone. So we're looking at the gross anatomy, the large scale anatomy of a long bone. Now, first and foremost, what is a long bone? A long bone is just a bone that is longer than it is wide. But if you're thinking of a bone, it's probably that cartoony version of a bone you're thinking of where it has the two kind of swollen ends and the long, narrow middle component. Right? That's a generic long bone. All right, so let's talk about some of the parts. We're going to talk about the regions, and then we'll talk about some of the specific characteristics. So we have three major regions of the long bone. We have the epiphysis, the metaphysis, and the diaphysis. The epiphysis, this is going to be the ends of the bone, so the proximal and distal ends, so the top and the bottom of the bone. That's going to be where it's kind of that swollen component, that little knobby part at the end. And the epiphysis mainly contains spongy bone. Just underneath and just above the epiphysis is the metaphysis. This is going to be a very narrow band of space between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, and this is where we have our epiphyseal plate, also known as your growth plate. So a small region, but still very important. And then lastly, we have the diaphysis. This is going to be the long shaft of the long bone, and this is where we have the medullary cavity. So let's take a peek at our long bone. In this case, we're looking at a femur, and we have some cutaways, but we see our epiphyses. Here's the one, the proximal one, the one that's closest to the hip. Here is the distal epiphysis down here towards the knee. We have two metaphyses, right, kind of where that knobby end starts to become a longer shaft. Up here in the cutaway, we can see the epiphyseal plate, sometimes called the epiphyseal line or the growth plate. All this in red shows the spongy bone, and as we move down, we get to this long, lean section. This is the diaphysis, and this is where we have a hollowed out component, right, called the medullary cavity. Again, medulla or medulla or medullary, you want to think some sort of middle space. We have yellow bone marrow contained inside of that, right, and this is mainly made of compact bone, so we have a difference in what type of bone we find where. As we get towards the ends of the bone, we find spongy bone. In the middle, we find compact bone. And then covering this entire bone, we only see a small sliver of it right here, but this would be a covering for the entire bone. We see the periosteum, which is a living covering surrounding the bone. It's also where we can bring in blood vessels like this nutrient artery that can actually wind their way into the bone. And then on the ends, at the very, very ends, up here and down here, we have articular cartilage. That articular cartilage is going to function to help protect the ends of the bones where the joints occur. So some of these are things we just mentioned, but we're going to talk about really quickly. We have the endosteum. This is on the very inside. This is going to be the lining inside of that medullary cavity, and this is going to be where we have growth, repair, and remodeling. We're going to talk about what growth, repair, and remodeling looks like later, but we just want to keep that in mind. The periosteum, I already mentioned, is the outer covering, and this is where we can bring in things like blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatic vessels. It's also going to be where tendons and ligaments attach. So when we have muscles anchoring to our bones through tendons, they're anchoring those tendons down on the periosteum. And same thing when we are anchoring a bone to another bone, usually across a joint, we have those ligaments. And then the articular cartilage I mentioned at the very ends of the epiphyses, where bones articulate with other bones. We have this thin layer of hyaline cartilage. And again, this is to help kind of give some protection. It can absorb some of the shock from movements, and it also can reduce the friction that occurs there. If you were to have bone on bone, you would definitely have a lot of issues because you wouldn't be able to absorb as much of that shock from movement and force, and you would definitely feel the friction. Let's take a look at the endosteum, the periosteum. So if we're looking at the endosteum on the very inside, we see those endosteums. We see a bunch of different bone cells too. We're going to talk about those on the next slide, so I won't get into them just yet. And then we also have the periosteum, this kind of cellular and fibrous two layers coming together to provide a nice covering over the bone. Yeah, so just keep those terms. Again, we're looking, if you're looking on the right, the terms osteoclast, osteocyte, osteogenic and cell, and osteoblast. We're going to talk about those guys in just a little bit. So keep those just in your head, but don't worry about them just yet. All right, moving on to more gross anatomy of the bones. The long bone is just one type of bone. We also have flat bones. These are made of a layer of spongy bone, also diploid, but I'm just going to call it spongy bone for you guys. And then sandwiched by a layer of compact bone on each side. So we have a layer of compact bone, spongy bone, and then one more layer of compact bone if we're looking at how the flat bone is arranged. So if we look at that like we see in the skull here, we see that compact bone up top, spongy bone in the middle, compact bone on bottom, with periosteum all the way around, right, top and bottom. Now, with this particular chapter, the thing that makes it a little bit tricky, it's not just because we have to know the names of a bunch of bones. We also have to know different markings on the bones. There's 3 general classes of bone markings. These are going to be things that you can use to help identify bones. These are like surface features. Every individual bone is a little bit different depending on what that bone is made to do, where it's found in the body. So the markings we find on a humerus are going to be very different from the markings we find on something like a cuneiform. So let's go ahead and talk about the 3 general groupings for bone markings. We have articulations. This is where 2 bone surfaces come together. We'll see these guys when we talk about the joints. We have projections. This is an area of bone that projects above the surface. We can see these being used for like attachment points. So if a tendon or a ligament needs something to attach to, a projection, a little bit of bone that sticks out, is really useful for that. We also have holes. This can be a full-on opening or a groove. Usually we're looking at being able to allow blood vessels or nerves into the bone. So here are some examples, and on the next slide we have a long list of them, so I'm not going to go over all of them here, but we're at least going to look at a few. So we have like these condyles down here on the bottom. I'm on the left over here looking at the femur, as well as the humerus. We see these condyles. These are these rounded projections, right? We see a tuberosity. This is like a raised rough edge. We see a sulcus. This is like a little valley between 2 raised components. And we see a fossa, which is like a little shallow bowl, right? Like a shallow valley, right? These are just some of the things that you're going to be going into, right? We see the fossa again over on the pelvis, but we also see a crest where it comes up and over, kind of sticks out. Whereas the fossa, it's again creating that little like shallow bowl. And then some of the openings that we see, right? We see like the sinuses all in green. We have foramen. This is going to be an opening, like a hole. We have a fissure. This is like a wider opening, like a slit or a slot. And then protuberance, this is going to be an area that kind of sticks out a little bit. So here is a list of all these different markings that you may see. I know this list looks really long, but if you've been looking at the list for all of the terminology that you'll be using on like an exam, it's an extremely long list. This here though, if you know these marking terms, especially if you also know your regional terms, the bone markings don't become as difficult, simply because now you're just kind of combining them together in a lot of cases. So let's say we're talking about the mental foramen. The mental foramen name alone tells you where to find it and what it looks like. So mental is our regional term for the chin, foramen is our term for a hole through a bone, and so we would be looking for a hole in the chin area on the skull there. So if you know these marking terms in general, then, and you know your regional terms and your bone terms, then it's really not as bad of a list because you're really just combining a lot of these things together. So do take the time to go through, maybe even make flashcards for the bone markings because the list is a long one. All right, now we're going to kind of take ourselves back to the bone cells and tissues. The bone cells and tissues should be a little bit of review because we've seen some of these things before, but we're going to get a little bit deeper. So we're going to talk about bone first, and then we'll talk a little bit about some collagen. But remember, the bone tissue is a solid matrix supportive connective tissue. The matrix is a solid based on calcium salts. Right, that's the big thing. There's a long list of names here of all the different types of salts. I'm not as worried about you remembering all those names, but you should know that they're a calcium-based salt for the matrix. And there's really not a whole lot of cells in it. Most of it is acellular. But the cells that we do find in bone tissue are in this list down below. We have our osteogenic cells, which are stem cells that lead to bone cells. We have osteoblasts, right, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. Now, before I get into each of these, I do want to mention the terms. We're seeing osteo over and over again. That's going to be our prefix for bone. Osteogenic. Genic, we think creation or beginning. So osteogenic, we're thinking this is a cell that is the beginning line of bone cells. It's the beginning cell for that. Osteoblast, when we see blast, we think we're building something. So osteoblasts are going to help build or form new bone. Osteocyte, site we think cell. These are just the maintenance bone cells. They're just kind of doing their daily bone lives. They are found in lacuna, just like the cartilage cells. Any supportive connective tissue cell is going to be found in a lacuna. And then osteoclasts, we think we're breaking something down, we're resorbing something. So osteoclasts are going to break bone down, which sounds like a bad thing, but in many cases we do need that to occur. We'll see osteoclasts play a very important and necessary role when we talk about remodeling. So here's our different bone cells. We have our osteocyte, which maintains bone. We have our osteoblast that builds bone. We have our osteogenic cell that is a stem cell, and then our osteoclast, which is going to break bone down. Now, when it comes to bone, we have two main types. We have compact and spongy bone. Compact bone, we should at least be somewhat familiar with because we talked about it when we were looking at our tissues. It's a really dense, strong form of bone. We find this right underneath the periosteum, and it's there for support and protection. It's compact, it's dense, it can withstand force, right? So it's really good for being able to carry weight. It's really good for protection. The structural unit of compact bone is called the osteon, which is like a series of concentric circles of that matrix. Each concentric ring is called a lamella. And in the very center of the osteon, we see a central canal. That central canal is going to be what has the blood vessels, the lymphatic vessels, nerves, and then we also, the central canal can perforate in to the lamellae through perforating canals. Throughout those concentric rings, we find the osteocytes inside their chambers called lacunae, and they're connected together through canaliculi. So if we look at a cartoon drawing of compact bone, this is what we would see, right? So we see that it almost looks like a forest of trees that was cut down, and we're looking down at the stumps, right? So each of these kind of trees is an osteon, right, with their circles in the inside. In that darker gray, we have our bone cells, our osteocytes in their chambers. We have our central canal with our nerves, with our lymphatic vessels and blood vessels. And we see you can kind of see the canaliculi that are branching out and connecting these all together. Right. Compact bone under the microscope is very distinct. This is one you should definitely be able to identify by sight because the coloring and the shape is very different from pretty much every other tissue we have seen in this class. Right. And then just this is a cartoon depiction of the same thing, right, which is not as clear. I think honestly the compact bone under the microscope is very distinct, very clear of what you're looking at, right? We can see that osteon, we can see those concentric lamellae, we can see the osteocytes, we can see the central canal. You can even kind of see the canaliculi running between the osteocytes kind of faintly. The other one we haven't really talked about though is spongy bone, also known as cancellous bone. They are still found in lacunae, right? Those osteocytes are still found in lacunae because they're still a supportive connective tissue. But rather than have this concentric ring appearance, we're going to have a network, like a net-like, lattice-like network of little spikes called trabeculi. They're going to form along lines of stress. This helps give some strength to the bone, but it also, because there's lots of pockets between these spikes, this is going to lead to a lightweight nature of the bones, right? Because it's not completely solid, it's not super dense the way compact bone is. So this is going to help remove some of that weight from the bones. Otherwise, we'd be extremely heavy. Right, so here's what it looks like, right? We have all these trabeculi running all over in kind of a net or a lattice-like structure. We still have the canaliculi and the bone cells living inside of their chambers, right? We see our osteoblasts and osteoclasts that are going to help with building and tearing down bone as needed. And then we also have the blood supply, right? The blood supply with these, remember, if you think about the compact bone, every single one of those osteons has blood vessels running through its center. Well, those blood vessels have to enter in the bone somewhere. And so they're entering in these metaphyseal artery and veins, the epiphyseal arteries and veins, and the nutrient arteries and veins, right? So we can jump inside the bone into that medullary cavity and really spread out and then create smaller blood vessels that can get into all the nooks and crannies.